So I think in the interest of time, the fact that there's a lot of people here, not just from the department, but obviously we have a lot of family members. Thank you all for coming. We have a number of people who are listening in from wherever in the world they are. So I think we really probably should get started. Even though I think, but we should do that. And in that vein, I should promise I'm going to keep my introduction no more than 20 minutes. So I think we all appreciate that what we're here to do is to witness, to participate in, to evaluate in some ways the work that Joseph R.A. Kincaid has spent this time over the past 4.5 years. And if you're wondering, as I am still, what the RA is, I'll gladly tell you. I have absolutely no idea what that means. It's on all his papers. I have no clue. So Joseph arrived, I guess it was about 4.5 years ago.
Yep.
And I knew that he was going to be a really terrific student. And part of the hint here was that right off the bat, he got a very prestigious MSN pre-doctoral fellowship. So that was great news for really everybody, especially me, because it was free. Free is a four-letter word, right? So at the beginning, he was off to a great start, and many of you attended the recent Art Baker lecture. And of course, he won the Art Baker Award, which is, I think, the highest honor. I'm not sure, but if it's not the highest, it's certainly among the highest honors that a graduate student can receive. So he started off really well. He ended really well. Not surprising, because what he's going to tell us about in a few minutes, I'm reading it, is about the projects, not all of them, there's just not enough time, but the 3 projects that I think are on tap. And the first one is, it's about a malaria drug that he and other members of the group, as part of a team led by Joseph, very important contribution. Because we don't think about malaria all that much, but the fact of the matter is, in the third world, this is a big deal. And in fact, when I was told in writing that there are at least 300 million people just in Africa, of course, that's not the entire third world. We have South America, we have parts of Asia, right? At least 300 million people that need this drug, and only 2 million can afford it. Cost is another big 4-letter word here. It's a different way to think about doing research. And so when I heard this, I gathered, I said to Joseph, get the team in here. I want to talk to everybody. And I think there were 4 people, 3 people involved in this project. I sat them around the table in my office. I said, guys, I just heard that there's 300 million people depending on you to make this drug. No pressure. Damn it, get in the lab and let's make this not only a cost-effective way, but a great way. And that's what has happened. Thank you, Joseph and the team, for this contribution, which is now going. They sent it, the Gates Foundation commissioned this, and it went to India, the IICT, I think it was in Hyderabad, I could be wrong, but this is the Indian Institute of Chemical Technology. They scaled it up a little bit. Now it's at the next level, which is the multi-kilo level. I don't know what this translates in. I just don't know how many more people potentially could benefit from this, but this is not a trivial task. Then the pandemic. And some of you may already know about it or have taken it or even be on it. Right? The Paxlovid story, the Pfizer $22 billion with a B dollars in 1 year from this drug. Unbelievable. Well, why would anyone think, and this is again something we were asked to do by the Gates Foundation, who asked that we come up with a competitive green synthesis relative to what Pfizer has done. Now, why would anyone in his right mind think that Pfizer, with its billions and billions of dollars earned every year, could possibly compete with Joseph and the team? You don't let got that joke. That's a joke, but it's true. Okay. The reality is, and I think you have a slide comparing right exactly what you guys did. Pfizer and all its assets and everything that, of course, now producing mostly for the Western world. Of course, we're interested in the third world. It's a different kind of mentality. But this was project number 2, which was also successful. As if that isn't enough, I told you only 20 minutes. Project number 3, right, is an important development on the chemistry that's now enabled to take place in water. Because, and I hope I'm not stealing too much of your thunder, I don't know exactly the details of what you're going to say. Not too late if I do, it's happening anyway. But what the technology that we had, or still have, needed a sort of an upgrade. And the upgrade, as Joseph will describe, had to do with biodegradability. In other words, it's an enabling technology. We want to do chemistry in the water, not in organic solvents. But that technology was, I don't know, 10, 12 years old, and the focus has shifted to how to deal with that technology downstream. What's the processing? Don't we have an issue over there? Well, it turns out companies, this came from a company, Novartis. So the project went to Joseph. We need something to replace that. Well, this is the story that he's, I think, going to conclude with.
I'll start with it.
Oh, you're going to start with
Yeah,
Savie. Okay, I got it backwards. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're about to find out what replacement technology he's developed along with others in the group, but led by Joseph, that will now go forward and take the place of the existing technology as we switch from a petroleum-based fuel. And that's, of course, what we're doing, is hoping that the world will see the value, moving from waste generating, petroleum depleting, etc., to just chemistry done by nature. Right? Another question is then biology. How come chemistry is not in water? Well, that's where we come in, and that's where this technology is a major contribution. So you're going to hear some, still 3 really important sort of stories told by Joseph. So I think we're in for a treat. Now, what's he going to do next? To be determined, is, since he is the person responsible for, in large measure, the malaria drug and the Savie that you're about to hear about, both of those are now being scaled up by the same company, which is an American company, but the labs are in China. So I think if he's interested, at least on a temporary basis, till he gets a more sort of settling job that he's interested in, we're hoping at least that he will be the consultant to the company that's doing the scale up, because after all, he did work. So we're better on the planet to help them make that malaria drug, to help them scale up the technology. And that's kind of where we are. So I don't know if he's accepted that. I mean, this is all happening, you know, I'm apart from that. It's really his call, but that may happen while he's in the process of getting something that he's more interested in long term. So thank you for your contributions, Joseph. We all, I'm sure, wish you very well, whatever you decide to do in the future. And I think everybody's looking very much forward to your presentation before we grill the hell out of you at the end. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you all for being here. This is really excellent turnout, and thank you to everyone joining us on Zoom as well. So, as Bruce mentioned, today I'm going to be discussing with you my efforts over the last 4.5 years to develop new tools for doing chemistry sustainably and how I've applied those new tools and technologies to the synthesis of real-world pharmaceuticals. So stop working. Sorry, give me 1 second. My screen's frozen.
All right, that was a great talk.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, no kidding. Let's try this again. There we go. Perfect. All right. So this presentation, as Bruce mentioned, is going to cover 3 topics. The first is the development of a new fully biodegradable surfactant called Savie that enables us to perform organic synthesis entirely within an aqueous medium. Highlights of this project include the improved sustainability of the surfactant itself compared to prior generations of surfactants, as well as the improvement in the sustainability and efficiency of the reactions performed using the surfactant. These reactions include many examples of late-stage functionalization, as well as cover a broad scope of different reaction types. The second project covers the development of 2 new sustainable routes to the antimalarial drug Pyronaridine that I helped devise in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with the eventual goal of distributing this important drug at low cost to the developing world. And finally, also in collaboration with the Gates Foundation, I helped to develop a new sustainable route to the anti-COVID drug Nirmatrelvir, which is the key ingredient in Pfizer's Paxlovid. So let's start with my motivations. The overarching goal of the Lipshutz Group is to reduce the chemical industry's reliance on environmentally egregious organic solvents. These solvents tend to be flammable, toxic, carcinogenic, environmentally harmful, and they're generally non-renewable. And when we're done with them, what do we do with them? We either burn them, thus releasing climate-altering gases directly to the atmosphere, or we bury them where any breach of containment would constitute an ecological catastrophe. World governments have begun to recognize the harm that these solvents pose and have begun implementing more and more stringent regulations on their use. But unfortunately, these egregious solvents still make up the bulk of waste generated in the chemical industry, with well over half of the amount of waste in the pharmaceutical sector alone being attributable to these organic solvents. And so for all of these reasons, a greener alternative is needed. And what better alternative exists than nature's chosen solvent, water? Water is non-flammable, non-toxic, inexpensive, and omnipresent. And while it's traditionally been thought of as the boogeyman of organic synthesis, owing to issues of substrate insolubility and reagent moisture sensitivity, both of these issues are obviated by the inclusion of a small amount of a non-ionic micelle-forming surfactant. So shown here is TPGS, which is the longtime workhorse surfactant used in the Lipshutz Group. It's constructed from vitamin E attached to polyethylene glycol or PEG methyl ether via a succinate linker. When placed into water, the surfactant molecules self-assemble into nanomicelles, which contain a lipophilic core into which lipophilic substrates and catalysts can be dissolved. In doing so, we're able to solubilize otherwise water-insoluble compounds within a bulk aqueous medium. Furthermore, because these substrates are sequestered within the micellar cores, they're protected from attack by the surrounding water. And this enables us to do meaningful chemistry with otherwise water-incompatible reagents, such as acyl chlorides and organozinc reagents. And finally, because these substrates are crammed into the relatively small space of the micelles, they're subjected to very high local concentrations. And this leads to much greater rates of collisions between molecules and thereby faster reaction rates at lower temperatures. Hence why we often refer to this as micellar catalysis. Over the years, a number of groups have contributed to a growing portfolio of so-called designer surfactants, which are so named because they were specifically designed to enable organic synthesis in water. We've already seen the vitamin E-based TPGS 750M from our group, and also from our group is the beta-citosterol-based NOC. Other examples include the fatty acid and proline-based PS 750M from our colleagues in the Honda group, as well as the rosin-based APGS 2000M from the Huang group. And while it's fantastic that all of these examples make use of bio-derived lipophilic moieties, what's not so great is that they all rely on PEG as their hydrophilic moieties. From a purely chemical standpoint, PEG is not desirable because it, as a polyether, it tends to form hydroperoxides on exposure to air, which probably aren't harmful to human health in and of themselves, but can certainly be detrimental in oxidant-sensitive reactions performed in the micellar medium. Furthermore, and most importantly, PEG is not ideal from a biodegradability standpoint. And so our colleagues at Novartis reached out to us and asked, hey, can you make a new fully biodegradable surfactant that uses a polypeptide instead of PEG as its hydrophilic moiety? And so that brings me to my first project, the development of a new fully biodegradable surfactant that enables us to do organic synthesis in water. The initial suggestion from Novartis was to use the pegylation alternative, passylation, which is the use of a peptide containing only proline, alanine, and serine residues, hence PAS. These were developed for bioconjugation applications where PEG was deemed to be inappropriate. And the reason the specific sequence of amino acids is so useful for this is because it avoids the formation of strong intramolecular hydrogen bonds that would lead to the formation of deleterious secondary structures that would severely limit its solubility in water. Instead, because it doesn't form these hydrogen bonds very strongly, it's allowed to adopt what's called a random coil conformation in water. And this, coupled with its hydrophilicity, makes it an excellent analog of PEG. Unfortunately, even though I wanted to use this to make a surfactant, there was a problem because the way that you typically make these PAS peptides is by encoding them directly into the gene for the protein that you're trying to bioconjugate. And this is not something I could do for a small molecule surfactant. Instead, I'd have to rely on traditional, i.e. environmentally egregious methods of amide bond formation that generate huge amounts of both toxic coupling reagent and organic solvent waste, and thus completely defeats the purpose of making the surfactant in the first place. So instead, I looked to peptide homopolymers, which are polymers made up of repeating units of just one amino acid. These are easily accessed via their N-carboxy anhydride or NCA monomers. But there's a problem with this too, because none of the proteinogenic amino acids, the amino acids used in the body to build proteins, would be appropriate for my use case because their respective homopolymers all form those strong intramolecular hydrogen bonds, causing them to fold into alpha helices and beta sheets that severely limit their solubility in water and make them very unpeg-like. So instead, I looked to polypeptoids, which are N-functionalized polypeptides. This N-functionalization obviates the formation of those intramolecular hydrogen bonds and thus allows these polypeptoids to adopt random coil conformations in water. Fortunately for me, the simplest polypeptoid, polysarcosine, turned out to be perfect for my application. Polysarcosine is derived from the biogenic but non-proteinogenic amino acid N-methylglycine, also called sarcosine. And it's easily accessed through the sarcosine N-carboxy anhydride or SAR-NCA monomer. Polysarcosine has been widely used as a biodegradable PEG replacement in a number of applications ranging from bioconjugation to biomaterials. And so it seemed like the obvious choice for this project. And I'd just quickly like to thank Dr. David Fialo for his input on selecting this amino acid. So now that I had selected polysarcosine as the hydrophilic moiety, I could go about actually making a surfactant. The optimal surfactant was named Savie, which stands for sarcosine plus vitamin E. And it's made in a straightforward 3-step 1-pot process involving first the deprotonation of vitamin E using sodium hydride, followed by the slow addition of the SAR-NCA monomer. As this happens, the phenoxide that's formed in the first deprotonation step acts as a nucleophile, attacking the SAR-NCA monomer, popping it open and blowing off CO2. This then results in a secondary amine that can act as the nucleophile on the next equivalent of the monomer. And this continues until we consume all of the monomer and arrive at a polymer with an average of 15 sarcosine repeat units. This polymer then has a secondary amine, which can be capped simply with the addition of acetic anhydride. And then Savie can be isolated from this mixture First, by quenching sodium hydride with a small amount of acetic acid, filtering it to remove sodium acetate, and then simply pulling off the THF in vacuo. The ability to remove and recover the THF in this reaction means that this is an exceptionally green process. And actually, if you do the calculation, you'll find that this process to make Savie generates 4 times less waste than does the synthesis to make TPGS, which is a pretty big improvement. Furthermore, Savie has another benefit in that it exists as this finely divided powder. This is in contrast to the sticky, difficult to handle waxes that are characteristic of pegylated surfactants such as TPGS. These waxes, in addition to being difficult to handle and dispense, are also, they take prolonged stirring to dissolve in water, whereas powdered Savie dissolves in water within seconds, making it far more convenient to work with, especially at large scales, which is ultimately the intention of making this surfactant. So now that I had Savie, a polysarcosine-derived surfactant, I could start to investigate the properties of the structures that form when Savie is dissolved in water. And so to do this, I used 2 techniques, dynamic light scattering and cryochem imaging. These both indicated that Savie self-assembles into roughly 13 nanometer spherical micelles, as well as forms 270 nanometer micellar aggregates. So now I want to show you some of the actual reactions that I performed using Savie. I don't have time to go over every reaction type I tried, so instead I've chosen to focus on reactions which provide the best contrast to TPGS. These reactions include many examples of late-stage functionalization in order to demonstrate the applicability of this new surfactant medium to both process and medicinal chemistry applications. And it's important to note that in every case that I tried, except for one, Savie outperformed or performed equally or outperformed TPGS. And as we'll see, this is likely due to the DMF-like nature of Savie's polyamide hydrophilic moiety, which helps to solubilize materials within the Savie-derived micelles. And we'll see this frequently throughout. So the first reaction type I want to show you are the palladium-catalyzed Suzuki-Mayora reaction, cross-couplings, which were performed with help from my colleague Nandi. In the first example, en route to the herbicide Arylex, we saw a significant improvement in yield going from TPGS to Savie, from 82% in TPGS to 94% in Savie. This, as mentioned, is likely due to the better ability for the Savie polyamide to emulsify these difficult to solubilize reagents within the Savie-derived micelles. The second example, involving the indomethacin derivative, provided some really interesting insights into this micellar medium. As we can see, both Savie and TPGS performed equally, both above 90% yield in this reaction when 10% toluene was included as a co-solvent. However, when the co-solvent was omitted, Savie didn't really change. It performed equally well regardless of whether the co-solvent was present, but the TPGS yield tanked down to 67%. The reason for this becomes abundantly clear when we see what the actual reactions looked like. The reaction in TPGS clumped up on the SIRVAR, thereby occluding the starting materials and preventing it from going to completion. Whereas the reaction in Savie remained well emulsified throughout, allowing those starting materials to find each other and react more fully. This same effect was seen for a number of substrates, wherein both surfactants performed equally in the presence of a co-solvent, but Savie fared much better in the absence of a co-solvent. The important takeaway is that Savie is able to reduce our reliance on environmentally egregious organic solvents by reducing or eliminating the need for organic co-solvents. But Savie is ultimately intended for large-scale pharmaceutical synthesis. And so it was really important to demonstrate that this emulsifying effect was not simply limited to tiny vial scale reactions. It could actually be applied to larger gram scale reactions, which is exactly what I've done here en route to the anti-cancer drug Sinitigib. As we can see, the reaction in Savie remained well emulsified throughout. I don't know if you can see it on this screen, but there's a really nice emulsion in Savie, whereas the reaction in TPGS separated into a biphasic mixture. And importantly, this better emulsion in Savie led to a 10% increase in isolated yield. So now that I was satisfied that Suzuki-Mayora reactions work really well in this new surfactant medium, I could turn my attention to other reaction types. So let's look at amide bond formations using the green coupling reagent COMU. Amide bond formations are the single most heavily utilized reaction in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's critically important that I demonstrate that Savie was capable of facilitating them. Again, just as in the Suzuki reactions, I saw a significant increase in yield when switching from TPGS to Savie. I think this is likely due to the ability for that Savie polyamide to better solubilize these highly polar coupling partners within the hydrophilic region of the micelles. And this prevents clumping and thus occlusion of the starting materials and allows the reactions to go further. This emulsifying effect was not just observed for peptide-like substrates, such as the one shown here, but also for more lipophilic substrates, such as the one derived from ibuprofen and fluoxetine. So that's amide bond formation. So let's look at nitro group reductions using carbonyl iron powder, or CIP. CIP is a cheap but highly active form of pure iron that's highly selective for nitro groups in water. Again, we see a huge increase in yield from TPGS, switching from TPGS to Savie. And so these nitroarine starting materials tend to be highly crystalline, which can severely limit their solubility and emulsifiability in aqueous surfactant media. What I think is happening is that that DMF like Savie polyamide is better able to break up the crystalline lattice of those nitroarenes, exposing more of the material to the reducing agent and thus leading to better conversions and hence isolated yields. Furthermore, the presence of functionalities such as triazoles and polycyclic heteroaromatics further compound the emulsifiability issues presented by these nitroarenes and thus further exemplify the superior enabling properties of Savie versus TPGS. So let's look at Buchwald-Hartwig aminations, which are one of the most important palladium catalyzed reactions used in the pharmaceutical industry. They allow us to access carbon-nitrogen bonds that are nearly ubiquitous in pharmaceuticals. And we observed that in many of these co-solvent-free reactions, Savie outperformed TPGS. Furthermore, we were able to use as low as 1,000 ppm of palladium, or 0.1 mol%, to affect this transformation on even very highly functionalized substrates. In comparison, these same reactions performed in organic solvents typically rely on upwards of 2 to 5 mol%, or 20,000 to 50,000 ppm of endangered palladium. And so this really just serves to demonstrate the virtues of micellar catalysis in this case. So now I want to show you some examples of how Savie has been able to maintain some special benefits that used to be the exclusive domain of pegylated surfactant media. Back in 2015, our group disclosed a new heterogeneous catalyst, the iron ppm palladium nanoparticle. This catalyst is special in that it allows us to use very low loadings of precious metals to affect a variety of chemical transformations. The catalyst is made of an iron nanomaterial doped with very small amounts of palladium or other precious metals. And in developing this catalyst, our group discovered a new property of pegylated TPGS micelles, which is that they have a tendency to agglomerate around the metal nanoparticles. This is advantageous because it effectively acts as a direct delivery system of substrate-laden nanomicelles to catalyst-loaded nanoparticles, and hence it was dubbed the nano-to-nano effect. It's this close proximity of substrates to catalysts that enables the very low loadings of metal to be used. And it's thought to, the nano-to-nano effect is thought to operate by the polyether peg chain of TPGS acting as a supporting ligand on the metal nanoparticles. But it was unclear whether the same effect would be observed for Savie's polyamide hydrophilic moiety. But fortunately, TEM images demonstrate that yes, the Savie micelles do in fact agglomerate around these metal nanoparticles. In these images, you can see these little black slivers are the metal nanorods, and then the hazy gray blotches around them are the micelles and micellar aggregates. Might be more clear on this screen. And indeed, the reactions performed using this catalyst actually performed significantly better in Savie than in TPGS. And this is likely due to the better emulsions formed in this DMF-like medium. The important takeaway here is that the nano-to-nano effect is no longer the exclusive domain of pegylated surfactant media. And polyamide-derived surfactants such as Savie can also take advantage of this internal delivery system. One of the other virtues of micellar catalysis or aqueous chemistry in general is the ability to do what's called biocatalysis, or the use of natural or artificially evolved enzymes to affect various chemical transformations. In fact, micellar media has been shown to perform better than pure buffer because the micelles can act as reservoirs that sequester products of the reaction, preventing them from going out and oversaturating the enzyme's active site and thereby leading to product inhibition. And because we can use a common aqueous surfactant medium for both biocatalytic steps and chemocatalytic steps, we can actually chain these steps together into what are called multi-step one-pot chemoenzymatic sequences. One such sequence is shown here, involving first the palladium catalyzed cyanation, followed in the same pot by the reduction, asymmetric reduction of the olefinic moiety of an alpha beta unsaturated ketone by the enzyme ene reductase, followed again in the same pot by the asymmetric reduction of the resulting ketone using the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase. Now, over these three steps in one pot, TPGS gave a moderate yield of 54% isolated yield, whereas Savie gave a whopping 70% isolated yield, further cementing it as a viable alternative to pegylated surfactant media. And finally, another benefit to micellar catalysis is the ability to recycle the aqueous medium. So my colleague Maddie was able to demonstrate this for Savie by performing the same nickel catalyzed Makita-like CS bond formation a total of 4 times using the same aqueous Savie medium. Over the course of these 4 reactions, relatively little drop in yield was observed, and we only stopped after the 3rd recycle because the buildup of insoluble materials and salts had created a difficult to stir slurry, which inhibited mixing. But the ability to recycle the aqueous medium has the potential to significantly drop the environmental footprint of a process, especially in the agrochemical industry where they're working with huge volumes of solvents. And this media recycling is a more common practice there than in pharmaceuticals. So in summary, I've developed a new fully biodegradable surfactant that enables us to perform efficient organic synthesis entirely within an aqueous medium. The surfactant relies on less organic solvent by reducing or eliminating the need for organic co-solvents, and it leads to better emulsions and hence better isolated yields than do its predecessors. On top of all this, it retains the benefits that used to be the exclusive domain of those pegylated surfactants. So now let's look at an example of micellar catalysis being used in the real world, specifically in my collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in which I developed 2 new sustainable routes to the antimalarial drug Pyronaridine, with the eventual goal of distributing this drug at low cost to the developing world. The World Health Organization lists malaria as the 6th leading cause of death in low-income countries, with their World Malaria Report estimating 627,000 deaths due to malaria in the year 2020 alone. With nearly half of the world's population living in malaria-stricken regions, there's a constant and pressing need for the large-scale manufacture and distribution of effective antimalarials to the developing world. One such antimalarial is Pyronaridine. Pyronaridine was developed in the late 1970s in response to a rising resistance to the antimalarial drug chloroquine, which was the drug of choice at the time. Pyronaridine is highly effective, and studies have shown that when it's taken in combination with other drugs such as sulfadoxine or pyrimethamine, little to no resistance to the drug is observed. And on top of this, it's significantly less toxic than is chloroquine. And so as such a safe and highly effective drug, it's critically important that it be made readily available in the regions where it's needed most. But therein lies a problem, because the regions that need antimalarials the most tend to be very low income, and they can't afford large amounts of expensive medications. On top of this, from the perspective of pharmaceutical companies, there's very little incentive to distribute a drug with slim to non-existent profit margins. And the increase in environmental restrictions on chemical synthesis have effectively rendered many of the existing methods for making Pyronaridine nearly obsolete. And so to address this, the Gates Foundation reached out to us and asked if we could develop a safe, scalable, cost-effective, and environmentally friendly approach to the synthesis of Pyronaridine. So to start this project, we had to figure out how to take this molecule and break it down into simpler, commercially available parts, and then how to stick these pieces together to make Pyronaridine. So we can envision splitting apart pyronaridine into two fragments as shown here, and we can stick these fragments together using an SNAR reaction. This top fragment can be further broken down into these cheap commercially available starting materials, para-aminophenol, formaldehyde, and pyrrolidine. Then they can be pieced together using a Monish reaction. The bottom fragment can be formed in a concomitant cyclization deoxychlorination reaction on this bis-arylamine, which in turn can be produced through the copper catalyzed Ullmann reaction on these two commercially available starting materials. So now that we had this retrosynthetic analysis, all we had to do was figure out how do we take these commercially available starting materials and put them together to make pyronaridine. So ultimately, we came up with two separate routes. First is a 4-step linear approach involving a 2-step 1-pot sequence in water. And the second is a 5-step convergent route involving a 3-step tandem sequence featuring both solvent-free and aqueous chemistry. By providing both optimized routes, I can maximize the chances of success for the process chemists who are now working to manufacture pyronaridine using these protocols. Furthermore, because this synthesis is intended for large scale, I had to keep the challenges inherent to large scale chemistry in mind. And so, for instance, you'll see that none of these steps require column chromatography for purification. Instead, all of these steps were designed such that products could be precipitated and collected via filtration. Furthermore, issues of exotherms and runaway reactions are also addressed. So both the linear and convergent routes start with the same two reactions, namely the copper catalyzed Ullmann coupling performed in aqueous surfactant media, followed by the concomitant cyclization deoxychlorination reaction performed in recyclable toluene. So the initial Ullmann reaction proceeded smoothly in the aqueous surfactant medium, affording the bis-arylamine in quantitative yield. And I noticed that when I omitted the surfactant, there was a significant drop in yield down to 82%. And this suggests that some micellar catalytic effect is at play. The subsequent cyclization deoxychlorination step relies on the use of water-incompatible phosphorus oxychloride, so I could not perform this reaction in an aqueous surfactant medium. Instead, I chose to focus on minimizing the amount of organic solvent required in this transformation. And to do this, I increased the concentration to 1 molar from the more typical 0.25 or 0.5 molar. And I was also able to demonstrate that I could recover up to 86% of the toluene after the reaction, which in theory could then be reused for subsequent batches of the synthesis, further reducing the environmental footprint of this step. The linear approach continues directly from here, moving through a 2-step 1-pot sequence in water, which involves an acid-promoted SNAR reaction followed in the same pot by a Monish reaction using paraformaldehyde and pyrrolidine. The initial SNAR reaction used sulfuric acid both as a means to ensure regioselectivity for the amine substituted product, as well as to activate the electrophile toward nucleophilic attack by protonation at the heteroaromatic nitrogen. Once the reaction was complete, the mixture could be neutralized with sodium bicarbonate, and then the Monish reaction could be effected in the same pot by the sequential addition of triethylamine, paraformaldehyde, and pyrrolidine. The inclusion of triethylamine was crucial here because I found in its absence, the reaction would clump up on the stir bar, thereby occluding starting materials and preventing full conversion. However, in the presence of triethylamine, a nice emulsion forms that then slowly precipitates pyronaridine over the course of the reaction, which can then be collected via filtration. This 2-step sequence affords pyronaridine in quantitative yield over 2 steps. The use of water in this reaction has an additional advantage beyond the obvious sustainability aspect, and that's that it has a high heat capacity. This Monish reaction is exothermic. It produces a fair amount of heat over the course of the reaction. And so by performing this in an aqueous medium, the water is actually able to soak up a lot of that thermal energy and prevent a runaway reaction from occurring. This would otherwise be a real concern if we were doing this in organic solvents. As I mentioned, I isolated pyronaridine in quantitative yield over these 2 steps, and over the 4 steps of the entire linear sequence, it was isolated in 87% yield. In comparison to the analogous literature approach, which afforded pyronaridine in only 43% yield in organic solvents, this marks not only a significant improvement in efficiency of the reaction, but also a significant minimization of waste and an improvement in the pot economy of this process. The convergent route, which was performed with significant help from my colleague Rahul, starts with a similar Monash reaction to what we'd seen previously. However, you'll notice this is performed under neat conditions, which means there's no solvent included. This is advantageous from an environmental standpoint because it means less waste. But since there's no water there to soak up that thermal energy, we had to think of something else. And it turns out this exotherm can be reasonably mitigated by the portion-wise addition of paraformaldehyde. And that affords this nitroarene intermediate that can then be reduced in the same pot to the corresponding aniline by the sequential addition of an aqueous TPGS solution, 3 equivalents of hydrochloric acid, and palladium on carbon under an atmosphere of hydrogen. The HCl is playing kind of 3 roles here. One, it's preventing the decomposition of the aniline product, which is highly unstable in its free base form. 2, it's preventing poisoning of the palladium catalyst by the various amino residues on this molecule. And it's also acting as the acid catalyst in the subsequent SNAR step. So once the reaction was completed, the palladium on carbon could be removed via filtration, and then this aryl chloride that we produced earlier could be added directly to the filtrate to affect the acid-promoted SNAR reaction. This afforded pyronaridine in 95% yield over these 3 steps and 95.4% purity by HPLC. In comparison to the analogous literature approach performed in organic solvents, which only produce pyronaridine in 69% yield, we again see a significant improvement in efficiency using this tandem aqueous chemistry. We could quantify the improvement in the environmental impact of this sequence using what's called an environmental factor, or E factor. This is a green chemistry metric that is calculated as the ratio of the mass of waste generated to the mass of product isolated. And in doing this calculation, I found a 5-fold decrease in the environmental impact of this process versus the existing literature route. Something that's not taken into account in the E factor is the fact that by performing this in a tandem fashion, we can actually significantly reduce the amount of organic solvents spent in both intermediate purification and reactor cleaning. Furthermore, it doesn't take into account the type of waste that's generated. So it's worth pointing out that the literature approach primarily generates organic solvent waste, whereas our approach primarily generates aqueous waste, which can be handled in a fashion that's far less hazardous. So beyond the initial publication, I've had the opportunity to work with process chemists at PHT International who are now working to scale my methodologies. In addition to the 5-fold decrease in environmental impact that we observed, we also calculated a 30% decrease in cost relative to the existing process route used by Shinpeng Pharmaceuticals. Our hope is that by further developing this route, we'll be able to make this drug readily available in the developed world at low cost. So that brings us to my final project, the development of a new sustainable route to the anti-COVID drug Nirmatrelvir, which is the key ingredient in Pfizer's Paxlovid. Paxlovid is a combination therapy consisting of Nirmatrelvir, which is an inhibitor of the SARS-CoV-2 main protease, as well as Pyronaridine, which is an HIV antiviral that serves to boost the potency of Nirmatrelvir. As Bruce mentioned, the extremely sudden and high demand for this treatment led to $22 billion in sales for Pfizer in 2022 alone for just this treatment. Over the course of treatment, a single patient will ingest 3 grams of Nirmatrelvir, putting the global demand for this single drug in the tens of metric tons. Because pharmaceutical processes generally generate more than 100 times as much waste as they do product, we can expect that the synthesis of just this drug will produce kilotons of toxic and hazardous waste. And so to combat this, the Gates Foundation reached out to us and asked if we could develop a greener route, which we of course said yes. So just like with pyronaridine, we had to figure out how do we break this molecule up into commercially available parts that we can then stick together to actually make Nirmatrelvir. So we can kind of conceptualize Nirmatrelvir as being composed of 3 basic components that can be derived from these 3 commercially available starting materials. We can piece these together using a new methodology for amide bond formation recently developed in our group that makes use of the green coupling reagent DPDTC. Furthermore, the nitrile moiety could be furnished using a new palladium catalyzed methodology, also from our group, that takes a primary amide starting material and dehydrates it in water to the respective nitrile product. So to start this project, I began by optimizing this amide dehydration step. And as I mentioned, this is based on a palladium catalyzed methodology developed in our group that I actually helped to develop. It involves the reaction of a primary amide starting material with a sacrificial nitrile. The sacrificial nitrile takes an equivalent of water from the primary amide, effectively dehydrating it to the product nitrile, whereas the sacrificial nitrile itself becomes hydrated, forming the respective primary amide byproduct. The ability for the sacrificial nitrile to accept an equivalent of water from the amide means that it's often referred to as a water acceptor. Now, while this methodology worked great for the primarily aryl substrates at which it was aimed, when I tried to apply it to the Nirmatrelvir intermediate, I saw no conversion whatsoever. So to understand why, we have to delve a little deeper into this reaction. As it happens, this reaction exists as an equilibrium between the two amide nitrile pairs. We can push this equilibrium toward the right, towards our desired product, by simply increasing the electron withdrawing nature of the alpha substituent on the sacrificial nitrile. This allows this sacrificial nitrile to be more electrophilic and thus accept water more readily. If we compare the alpha substituents of methoxyacetylnitrile, which is the sacrificial nitrile is trying to use in this synthesis, if we compare that to the desired product, Bach-protected amino nitrile, we see that there's relatively little difference in the electronegativity at that alpha substituent. But if we were to instead swap it to a fluoro group instead of methoxy, we can significantly increase that electronegativity, thus making it a better choice for this reaction. So with this and a number of other optimizations, I was eventually able to get the overall yield, the isolated yield of this Bach-protected amino nitrile up to 93%. So now came the seemingly simple task of removing that Bach group. Bach deprotections are kind of a standard reaction that I think a lot of chemists simply take for granted. But for us, it was not that simple. We observed the formation of a significant amount of two nitrile hydrolysis side products, a primary amide and a carboxylic acid. These form because trace amounts of adventitious water in this acidic Bach deprotection medium can react with the nitrile to hydrolyze it to these two products. So to mitigate this, we tried a number of things. We tried using scrupulously dried solvents. We tried flame drying our glassware and even azeotropically drying our starting material. But even with all these measures in place, we were still seeing a significant loss of yield due to this unproductive side reaction. But what did we just learn from the amide dehydration methodology? We know that this nitrile is an excellent water acceptor, hence why it was so difficult to form in the first place. And this explains why it's so eager to take up any and all trace moisture in this Bach deprotection medium. I got around this in the amide dehydration step by the inclusion of a sacrificial nitrile as a competing water acceptor. So why not do something similar here and include a sacrificial nitrile in the mix to take up that trace moisture before it has a chance to react with our product nitrile? Well, as clever as I like to think I am, I was not the first one to come up with this. And actually, scientists at BMS had run into a similar problem with these Bach-protected alpha amino nitriles. They came up with the elegant solution of using acetonitrile both as the solvent in the reaction and as the competing water acceptor. And so by applying their methodology to this Bach deprotection, my colleague Juan was able to access this Bach deprotected amino nitrile in quantitative yield and high purity. So now with the amide dehydration and Bach deprotection steps fully optimized, we could turn our attention to this amide bond formation methodology, namely using the green and recyclable coupling reagent, DPDTC. This activates carboxylic acids as their respective 2-pyridyl thioesters, which can then react with an amine to afford the desired product amide. In comparison to traditional, i.e. environmentally egregious methods for amide bond formation, the byproduct of this DP-DTC reaction is benign, recyclable, and odorless tumor captopyridine. Furthermore, in contrast to typically formed activated intermediates, the thioesters exist as stable, isolable compounds, which is potentially attractive from the perspective of large-scale synthesis. Furthermore, these traditional methodologies for making amide bonds typically generate process mass intensities in excess of 45, whereas this DP-DTC-enabled amide bond formation typically produces single-step PMIs around 20, which is a significant improvement. So we're going to go through this kind of fast. Ultimately, my team and I were able to develop this 5-step 2-pot process en route to the penultimate intermediate to Nirmatrelvir. This involved the 2-step 1-pot DP-DTC enabled amide bond formation arriving at this intermediate that then in the same pot could be hydrolyzed to afford this carboxylic acid. This intermediate did not require intermediate purification and could be carried into the subsequent DP-DTC enabled amide bond formation arriving at this Bach-protected tripeptide. Now came the task of simply swapping this Bach group over for trifluoroacetamide, and we'd arrive at Nirmatrelvir. And we expected this to be trivial, and it turned out to be the most challenging step in the entire synthesis. But after much effort, we were finally able to do the exchange, arriving at Nirmatrelvir in 95% yield over these 2 steps and 70% yield over 7 steps in 3 pots. This is in comparison to the Pfizer route, which afforded Nirmatrelvir in only 48% yield, thus marking a significant improvement in the efficiency of this process compared to the existing one. Furthermore, in calculating the E factors, I observed that the environmental impact of this process was cut in half relative to Pfizer's. So I'd say we met the goal that we set out to achieve. So in summary, we've seen how I was able to develop a new fully biodegradable surfactant that enables us to do efficient organic synthesis in water. And we've seen how my collaborations with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have enabled the development of sustainable routes to 2 important drugs with the eventual goal of distribution to the developing world at low cost. And so with that, I would like to sincerely thank all of the members of the Lipshutz Group, both past and present, especially my PI Bruce, as well as all of my fantastic collaborators who worked so diligently to make this work happen. Thank you as well to my thesis committee and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, PHT, and the NSF for making this work possible. An incredibly big thank you to my amazing friends, family, and my brilliant fiance, Ann Williams. And thank you all for your attention. And I'd be very happy to take any questions.